Good morning. My name is Mark Mabry. I'm the Vice President at the MITRE Corporation and Director of the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center, one of 7 we have the privilege and honor of running for the federal government. This morning session is a true delight to introduce. If you find yourself breathless this morning, it's not because of the Aspen altitude. This is actually the Mission Impossible session. It couldn't be a better named session, where we're going to learn more from the Director of the National Security Agency and the former Director of the UK Government Communications Headquarters about responding to recent unprecedented cyber attacks. It's a distinct pleasure to welcome the moderator of this session, David Ignatius. I discovered last night when David and I were chatting that we share a heritage of Cambridge, England. He read in the arts, I read in the sciences. I think you were history, is that correct? Or
Economics.
Economics.
Even worse.
And even worse. And I was artificial intelligence. So David, as you all know, is a best-selling author and prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post. He has been covering the Middle East and the CIA for more than 25 years. Although his books are fiction, they're loosely based on the relationships that he has developed in events he's covered around the world. So be careful, you might be in his next book. Please give a hearty, warm Aspen Security Forum welcome to David.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Our session this morning, when it was originally pitched to me, was going to be called Eavesdropping on the World. And wiser heads prevailed, and the title is now Mission Possible, not Impossible. I take it that really is the same title, basically. And I want to begin by asking our 2 speakers, Admiral Rogers and Robert Hannigan, former director of GCHQ, to give us a sense of the state of that mission. We're 4 years after the Snowden revelations, a period when the world of SIGINT was rocked, when the initials NSA and GCHQ around the world seemed almost toxic. And there was a real question, how do these agencies recover? How do they regain trust? How do they deal with tech companies? How do they do that mission? And Admiral Rogers, let me ask you to begin by talking about whether you have the tools you need, you have the public support you need to do the things that the NSA does to keep the country safe.
So for the National Security Agency, we are committed to continue to execute the mission, and the mission keeps getting tougher. I have been a professional signals intelligence officer in the United States Navy for 31 years. And in those 31 years, the rate of change that I observed in many of our targets over the last few years, I have never seen target sets constantly change their communications profiles, constantly upgrade their technology, whether it be a nation state, whether it be a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The rate of change in our profession and the challenges for us to stay ahead of that keep growing, both in complexity and speed. The positive side is we have some incredibly motivated men and women who are every bit as agile as the challenges around us. So we have retained the ability to continue to generate insight, even as I acknowledge it is increasingly complex and more difficult, and sometimes, quite frankly, takes a greater increased level of investment to generate the same outcomes.
And Admiral Rogers, would you say, in your mind, in your assessment of the NSA situation, that the post-Snowden era really has ended, that we're in a different period now?
Certainly it's a different environment. What I told the team from the very beginning, so I've been in the job both as the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command now, coming up on 3.5 years. And what I told the team from the first day I got there was, the measure of our effectiveness will be our ability to generate value. If we focus on generating value for the citizens of the nation we defend and doing it within a legal and policy framework that generates confidence in the citizens that we support, guys, we are going to be fine. And we are not going to waste our time hanging our head. We're going to focus on doing the right thing the right way and ensuring the safety and the security of our citizens and our friends and allies like our British teammates. And so I'm the first to admit it's a little different. It's hard to believe we're coming up, 4 years. Hard to believe It's been 4 years, just a little over 4 years.
And all I'd add is I think the history of SIGINT is a history of reinvention because it's technology-driven, so the signals keep changing. But I agree with Mike that the pace of change over the last 5-10 years has been out of proportion to anything we've seen before, and it's going to get faster in the next 50 years for reasons we might discuss later. But I think we are up to the challenge. I think people don't always understand that even in the last 2 conflicts, the nature of the SIGINT challenge, the SIGINT battle space in Afghanistan, where we got our arms around it, did great work, was completely and radically different from the challenge in Raqqa and northern Iraq. And we had to reinvent particularly workforce skills. And as Mike says, I think it's taken a greater effort, and each target is absorbing more people and more technology. And the challenge will be to automate that in the future so that we can meet the scale.
I want to just note for the audience the importance and value for all of us that we have two members of the famous Five Eyes partnership up here together on stage. Famously, since World War II, the partnership between our signals intelligence collection and Britain's GCHQ has been one of the tightest bonds that there is in this intelligence world. And so I want to note in that context an anomalous moment, and I want to ask Robert Hannigan, who was GCHQ director until April, about a day in March of this year when Sean Spicer, then the White House press secretary, endorsed something that President Trump had noted on Fox News, the assertion by one of their commentators, Andrew Napolitano, which he said supported his assertion that his wires had been tapped at Trump Tower because President Obama had used GCHQ to facilitate this collection. And that produced a very unusual response from one of the world's most tight-lipped agencies. And I want to just ask Mr. Hannigan if he would recall that period, and also I want to ask whether it left any residual scars with your workforce at GCHQ.
I might go tight-lipped again, actually, David. I wouldn't overplay it. I think we got sucked into a dynamic that is an interesting one that you're familiar with here, and we were sort of collateral in that. I mean, we, like all agencies, everyone in this room, we ignore conspiracy theories every day. But when they get repeated from the podium of the White House, you really have to say something because it has a global reach. But I wouldn't overplay it. I think the interesting thing about it is, in the context of the last couple of days' discussion, say, on Russia, it looks more and more like a micro example of active measures to us, because we started to see in sort of January, February, this story with exactly the same wording in weird blogs coming out of places like Macedonia. And then it moved in the way that Clint was describing the other day across to what I think you would call the alt-right sites here in the US. Then it went to Fox and Friends, somebody who was a conspiracy theorist, to be honest, and then it got repeated. So it moved into the mainstream. So quite a nice example of something which we've never bothered to investigate, frankly, as an active measure, because it's not important enough. But it looks a bit like that kind of information campaign. But on the impact on the relationship, not at all. I mean, nobody in the UK took this seriously, so no journalist rated this story. So there wasn't a home story to tell. But it was important to preserve the relationship that we were very clear.
So I want to just press that a little bit, because that's a fascinating insight into a subject we have been discussing now for 3 days. And if I understood what you said, the allegation, this sort of conspiracy allegation that surfaced on Fox and Friends had begun with blogs, posts in Eastern Europe that, if I heard you right, likely originated with Russian or Allied help, and then made their way into the larger dialogue. And I want to ask Admiral Rogers if he tracked that same thing in the same period in doing NSA's work. But
I should just clarify that
right?
we didn't investigate this as an active measure, and this is my supposition, and it was interesting. Just it sparked something that we were discussing in the Russia session. It feels like that because some of these websites were in suspicious places and didn't seem to exist before. So it feels like that. We haven't bothered to put any effort into investigating it because we're too busy, frankly, doing real work. And a crazy story about me doesn't really matter. I don't care, and nobody.
The division between real work and other work is getting a little blurry.
It's not worth our investigatory effort. But it just felt a bit like what we were discussing the other day.
Admiral Rogers, did you chase this at all?
So, much like Robert, because we know the nature of our relationship, we know exactly what we do. It's interesting. Under the Five Eyes construct, one of the explicit tenets of the agreement is we will not use each other to violate the law of one of our own respective countries. So, hey, I can't do something in the United States because of a legal framework. Robert could GCH. We don't do that under the Five Eyes agreement. We specifically say we will not use each other to bypass laws, nor will we use each other to attempt to spy on each other. Again, part is one of the fundamental tenets of the whole Five Eyes construct.
So again, just on this question, one of the things you're doing is monitoring electronic
I found no
posts.
basis in fact on any of this.
Understand that, and that was made clear. But I'm asking a slightly different question. Did you find any evidence of Russian or Allied effort to begin to churn this in the information space before it surfaced?
As Robert said, this was not one in this particular instance where we opted to pursue this, but it is reflective in some ways to me of this broader trend of how information moves very quickly from sources that traditionally we would have thought very fringe, not particularly well sourced, not well respected, that very quickly is able to move rapidly across the globe into multiple different formats, multiple different nations. And the Russians, clearly, we have watched them use this as a technique.
And not to be a nuisance here, but you did see evidence that there was something on the fringe, which you didn't investigate in detail. But if I'm understanding, yes, something surfaced out there on the fringe before it ended up on Fox and Friends in the morning.
To be honest, I don't remember the specifics of this one particular case, other than I remember my immediate reaction, like Robert was. No basis, in fact.
So I've no evidence that this was a Russian operation. It could have just been some crazy conspiracy theorists. And as Mike says, the interesting thing is the way this sort of fake news spreads into the mainstream. I think that's the lesson from this. But yeah, there are plenty of other examples we've discussed this week. Who knows whether it was a state operation, and in a way it doesn't matter.
So let's turn to a question that many in our audience care deeply about, and that's the relationship between these two signals intelligence agencies and the tech companies here in America and around the world. Mr. Hannigan, you said just after you became head of GCHQ back in 2014, you wrote an article for the Financial Times, and I'll quote just a brief passage. You described U.S. tech companies as, quote, the command and control networks of choice for terrorists around the world. That put this issue of the company's responsibilities in assisting intelligence very squarely before people right at the start of your tenure. 2 years later, you gave a speech at MIT in March of 2016, and you then talked about your hopes for a new relationship between the tech companies, the tech sector, academic institutions, and the government agencies. So I want to ask you, you've been thinking about this from the first moment you came to GCHQ. How's that process going? First, in terms of your conversations with tech companies in the U.S., but more broadly with these dominant companies here in America?
Well, I think the context 4 years ago was very different. It was immediately after Snowden, who had poisoned the relationship between governments and the tech sector. It was very difficult to have a conversation with them, never mind to work with them from the UK perspective. And we were facing a new ISIL threat, and an organization that got the internet and got the power of the internet both to do their attack planning, but also propaganda and radicalization and recruitment in a whole new way, in a way that Al-Qaeda never had, and we've discussed that yesterday. So these two things had come together, and at that moment I did have a go at the companies because they were not helping on the operational side at that stage, and they were still in a state of denial about responsibility for the content they carried, which again we talked about a bit yesterday, and I think will later this morning. That has changed radically, to be fair. They are being much more helpful, and there's a much more sensible conversation. We have new legislation. We have the bilateral agreement that Tom Bossert talked about the other day, and if that gets through, that will address many of the problems that I was complaining about. And the general climate is just much more sensible, partly driven by terrorism. I think people see these atrocities, and people put aside their post-Snowden tensions, I think. On the encryption side, it is much more complicated. I'm a fan of strong encryption. Both our agencies have spent 70 years developing the best encryption in the world to protect everything from the firing chain down to domestic users. So we're not against encryption, but it's the abuse of encryption by a minority that we need to sit down with the industry and discuss. And again, that conversation has got much better. And on extremist content, I think the industry have got together. They've set up this forum. They do accept there's a role for industry here. As Mark Zuckerberg has said some very interesting and encouraging things, I think, and I'm hopeful that they'll get there with civil society, with governments, with academia. I would much rather that approach than legislation in lots of different jurisdictions, which will just be a bonanza for lawyers, really, arguing over what is extremist and what isn't. If we can get a cooperative approach, that would be much more effective and much easier, and I think there's a good chance of that.
If I could, I'd echo Robert's thought about if you look at how the dynamic has changed over the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, Boston Marathon bombing, San Bernardino, Paris, Copenhagen, London, multiple events where the threat continues to evolve, and much of social media and other forms of communications have been key components of these events. And that has enabled, I think, somewhat sadly in the sense that you never like the fact that it takes a trauma and the loss of life to drive people to, hey, look, we have got to look at this problem set differently. We've got actors out there who want to do harm to our citizens where they go work, where they go to concerts, where they eat at restaurants, movie theaters. ISIS wants to break our will. They believe that the West is inherently weak, that we can't stand the pressure, that if they can contest our ability to lead normal lives, not just on the battlefields of Syria and Iraq, but in countries in Europe and in the United States, they will break our will. That is their vision. And so you've seen a shift in many ways than what they focused on in the last 4 years. And one of the unintended byproducts, which is a positive in some ways, it has helped to enable a very different dialogue. Doesn't mean, don't get me wrong, doesn't mean everybody agrees and we all have a common vision. But we're able to have discussions now that, quite frankly, 4 years ago, in the immediate aftermath of the media leaks, just were never going to happen.
But let me ask each of you to be a little more specific about the state of cooperation and discussion between your agencies and the tech sector. It was 18 months ago, less than that Tim Cook was saying on behalf of Apple, we understand that there's a terrible threat just happened in San Bernardino, but we do not believe it's appropriate, nor could we technically open up a phone that the FBI believes has information that's useful. If I understand both of you, you're saying, well, we're beyond that point where there seemed a real disagreement. And if that's true, I'd like to know how we're beyond that point.
That's not exactly what I thought I said.
Okay, so tell me
what I thought I said was, look, number one, we're having a dialogue. Doesn't mean we always agree, but we're having a dialogue with each other. For me personally, with the exception of Iraq, Afghanistan, and some of the Five Eyes partners, the number one place I spend more time outside of Washington, D.C. anywhere in the world is Silicon Valley. I go out there because I'm interested in personally talking to leadership within the tech sector about, given the many challenges we have, encryption is just one of those challenges. Given the many challenges we have, both in terms of our desire to generate more knowledge and insight from a foreign intelligence perspective, but also our desire to increase the level of cybersecurity for our nation and the security of the devices and the information that we all use. In those areas, for example, the LATA area, we're having great conversations about, hey, so what are the technical standards we need to be looking at? What are the changes that we need to be need to be looking at, and some of the physical aspects of hardware that are being produced? What do we need to change in the cycle of patching, for example? How do we get to be a more agile ecosystem that's able in a much quicker way to deal with changes? The biggest thing that strikes me, and we talked about it in the very beginning, the rate of change in this mission set. Like I said, I've been doing this for 31 years, continues to blow me away. And one of the things I pound on the team that I'm a part of, speed, agility. Guys, we've got to be faster. We've got to be more agile. The world around us is changing. and we got to change with it. And one of those changes is we got to think about partnerships in a much broader way. Mm-hmm. It's not enough anymore, as important as our relationship is with each other, for example. It isn't just about great partnerships with intelligence organizations.
Absolutely, and we're both history fans, and I think if you look back at the last century, those great breakthroughs were in technology were government-driven, so digital computing, the internet, GSM, all the things that we now rely on, they were government-funded very often and military by origin. Nobody looks to government now for the best of innovative technology. They look to Silicon Valley. And of course, there's a crossover with Silicon Valley and government. So that, as Mike says, we can't do this on our own anymore. We absolutely have to use the brilliance that is out there in the technology sector and work with it.
You said, Mr. Hannigan, in your speeches, public comments, that you're not seeking a backdoor. You're not asking the tech companies for a backdoor. You're not seeking to weaken strong encryption. You just said that here. You believe in strong encryption. But as I read you, you're saying you do want access to laptops, phones, those tools in particular instances where they can help you with crucial intelligence missions. And that, further, if I understand you, that's part of doing business in the UK, that you need to understand as a tech company, you have to respond to lawful government attempts to gain information in these areas. Have I summarized that well, and how would you take that further?
I think that's a fair summary. We don't ask for backdoors. We're not asking for the weakening of encryption. Essentially, I agree with Tim Cook's principle that if the price of a particular operation is to weaken security for everybody, particularly somebody who spends most of his life doing cybersecurity these days, that's a price too high. The debate, I guess, on that particular case was that the right case to choose? Could in that particular instance, a solution have been applied which wouldn't have weakened security for everybody? And I don't want to revisit that, but I mean, it's a nice example of how there are actually ways around this debate. Nobody's going to uninvent end-to-end encryption in particular. And there is a bit of naivety out there that we can somehow legislate this away. Even if we could, it probably wouldn't be desirable. So we have to find cleverer ways around it. We might come on to this, but I think that's easier for SIGINT agencies than it is for law enforcement. We can do clever things under the law with the kind of capabilities that we have, that routine law enforcement trying to address really serious things like kidnapping and drugs and murder, who have relied on data in clear, unencrypted for the last 10, 15 years, can't do. There was a good report from the Berkman Center at Harvard about this. So it's really, it's a tough one for law enforcement.
I think, if I could, I think our challenge as a nation is that we're in a position now in the digital age where technology has outstripped our legal framework. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, within our legal construct, there has been a mechanism for the government to access communication in any form with an appropriate court order. We put a series of checks and balances in place, and the government, the executive branch, had to make an argument to the judicial branch and show probable cause and a basis of evidentiary support that supported the government's contention, hey, I have a reason to access this. And now we find ourselves in this new digital world where technology, really embodied in some ways in encryption, but I would argue it's much broader than encryption, has supplanted that. And now the technical means of accessing information is not within, for example, CALEA, the wiretapping laws in the United States from the 1960s that direct the phone companies in the United States. You must have the technical means to access phone conversations with a valid court order. That is the law in the United States, and it's been the law since, as I said, it was last updated in the 1990s. We don't really have an equivalent in this digital world. And so I think the challenge for us is, can we sit down as a society, because this is how important this is. This should not be necessarily mandated by the government or mandated by industry. We collectively, as citizens, need to sit down and figure out, what are we comfortable with here? And what's the level of risk and access that we want the government to have, under what circumstances, who should control it, and are there specific criteria that we should in place? So this isn't something that's just done capriciously. And I'm the first to admit, you don't want an intelligence professional like me making that decision. That is not in our nation's best interest.
So are you, Admiral Rogers, imagining that this implicit understanding, the word partnership was used earlier, would be an informal process of discussion, would be something that would be done more formally through legislation? How do you see this emerging?
I'd like to, personally for me, it starts with a discussion. So what's in the realm? To me, there's two questions. What can we do and what should we do? What can we do is both a technical question, what's within the realm of the possible, as well as what's appropriate. But the more important conversation that flows from that then is, so given what we can do, what should we do? And they are not the same thing. And they're not necessarily the same groups of people that are going to have that conversation.
Before we leave this, I want to just ask you to comment on one aspect of the discussion that surrounded the debate between Jim Comey was really the leading voice for the government, and Tim Cook, the leading voice for the technology companies. And back then, that was back when the most famous thing James Comey had done was have an argument with Tim Cook. Back then, the argument was that our intelligence, our SIGINT agencies were going dark. That was the phrase, that they were unable to capture the information that they wanted about these various very dangerous people and groups. And it was suggested, I think not entirely facetiously, that if Jim Comey really had a problem, he should take it to NSA. Because there were lots of tools and ways of getting inside things that NSA, with its intelligence mission, knew about that would be useful.
Of course, if I could remember, NSA is a foreign intelligence organization.
But
I don't break into phones in the United States, guys. That's not what we are about.
We're a foreign agency too.
So maybe the way we don't hear so much about going dark anymore. The Berkman report at Harvard, which said back then, well, it's not quite as dark as it may appear. With the passage of time, that looks more correct. And so let me ask each of you how dark is it from where you sit? It looks from the outside as if there's a little more light than we thought a year, 18 months ago. But tell us.
So, Robert, I have an opinion. From my perspective, first, remember, we're a foreign intelligence organization operating outside the United States. So the things that I can do legally and technically outside the United States, very different. I have options, capabilities that our law enforcement teammates don't be. If you're a sheriff in a county in Louisiana, you don't have access to the same range of capabilities. You don't have the same legal authority. You're not working the same targets. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. I remind people what are the challenges for law enforcement, whether it be at the local level or at the national level for our FBI teammates, is a little different than the challenges for us. We have both capabilities and we can work targets differently outside the United States than they can within the U.S. And I know Robert's got
exactly the same for us, partly because we're foreign-facing and partly because we've got capabilities, indeed, with our allies that law enforcement don't have. I think for law enforcement, they would say it's gone very dark, completely dark in some places. Very simply, if you law enforcement in the UK 10 years ago, if you served a warrant against somebody's broadband line at home, you would get the full take of everything they were sending through all the major servers, Gmail and Hotmail, because it was in clear between them and the data center. Now it's not, so they're getting nothing. So for a law enforcement who came to rely on this, it's a huge problem, and I don't know there's no easy solution. It may be they will never get back to that position. But what we can do, particularly as it's foreign-facing, for political and legal and civil liberties reasons, is very difficult to apply internally and probably isn't scalable.
So if I understand both of you, you're not so dark when you're looking at Raqqa. But if you're looking at Orlando or Manchester or domestic challenges,
we don't look at Orlando.
It's more you don't look at Orlando.
We don't look at Orlando.
But
we don't do to Manchester what we do to Raqqa. So
when MI5, when the FBI are looking at these domestic challenges, it's tougher for them. And so before closing out this subject, do either of you have any suggestions about how the domestic piece of this, which is not your responsibility, I think we all understand that, but any suggestions about how that domestic problem?
I mean, for us, we share technology with each other. We partner with each other. One thing about this, when we talk about, so for us, we don't use the phrase going dark, but I will say this. The price of some of this technology when it's applied internationally, and we're working it as a target in the foreign space, scale becomes much more complicated for us. It takes us a lot more effort, a lot more resources. It takes us longer sometimes because, quite frankly, we'll work other aspects rather than, and I don't want to get into details, but we'll work other aspects than, for example, focusing on the encryption aspect of a target. We'll look at it more broadly. We'll look at other aspects. The downside of this challenge on our side is, while we're not going dark, our ability to scale this globally, it's much tougher now. It takes longer to get access to the targets broadly, increased level of resources and investment to do it. That's the biggest change for us. So it's not that we're going dark. For us, the challenge is it gets harder, it takes longer, and it's a much more resource intensive.
And a higher skill set, I think, which we don't always have.
Changes your workforce composition as well. We have to get different skills in the workforce.
Just on the domestic challenge for us, which again is not our responsibility, if you look at the recent attacks, the good news is that none of these people were completely unknown to the intelligence services or the police. The bad news is that they weren't unknown and somehow they had not been caught. But there are things I think we can do to look at that 20 to 30,000 people in the UK who have at some stage touched the periphery of a counterterrorism investigation and use technology, and particularly data, better uses of data, to try to help do what we in the foreign space would call target discovery, and also to do prioritization better, because we cannot, there's no way that domestic service can put surveillance on 30,000 people, even if they wanted to, and that would not be desirable for all sorts of reasons. So, we can't do and wouldn't want to do blanket surveillance. Can we do clever things domestically that use the best technology? Well, probably, and we need to explore that.
And before we leave this broad question of terrorist targets and how to deal with them, I want to ask you about a question that's come up in almost every session that we've had here over the last several days, and that's Section 702 and its renewal. And I want to ask you, Admiral Rogers, we've had a lot of expressions by colleagues, other observers of the likelihood that it will be reenacted. But suppose it wasn't, or it was reenacted with significant additional privacy measures that slowed or significantly altered how 702 works. Just briefly tell us what difference that would make for
So
you
for
and
us,
NSA.
if we lost the authority that is inherent in Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act, last updated in 2012, the authority expires 31 December 2017. If we lost that, I have been very direct both with our congressional oversight, I have been very public about this, I've talked to the administration about it. If we lose this authority, we will have significant impact on our ability to generate the insights you have come to expect for us. I cannot replicate this via any other means. And if you take this authority away from us, you will see a significant reduction in our ability to generate insights that you have come to depend on. Now, if that is a conscious choice, and as a nation we decide that's in our best interest, that's one thing. But we need to go into this with our eyes open about just what does 702 generate in terms of value. And at the same time, I think it's very important that we have a discussion about, so how should we feel comfortable that 702 is applied in a legal way that appropriately protects the rights and the privacy of our citizens? That's also a very important discussion. And so there's a whole host of things that are built into the 702 structure. Number one, it is collection overseas. Collection overseas. Number two, collection overseas against non-U.S. persons. We cannot use this as a vehicle to collect on a U.S. person overseas. Number three, it is for a series of specific purposes as delineated in the statute. It's not a blank check that says we can use 702 to collect anything we want against anybody overseas who's not a U.S. person. The legislation specifically says you can use this authority for a series of very specific purposes, specific kinds of targets. So we bound the problem in terms of what this allows us to do. We also bound the problem in the sense that when we then go to the court and we get permission to compel a private provider to provide us information, we have to show the court and the Department of Justice that the information that we are showing that we want, it might be an email address, it might be a cell phone number, we have to show that that data ties to one of those categories in the legislation. It's specifically associated with counterterrorism. It's specifically associated with proliferation, for example. It's not, we'll give you any selector and just give us everything that we want based on this email. We have to show that it's tied to the legislation. The next set of protections that are put in place really for us then are, once we get the data, we then also make sure that as we are reporting on it, publishing information that helps feed policymakers and operational commanders, gives them insights on what's going on, we put additional levels of protection like we don't mention U.S. persons by name. We say U.S. person 1, U.S. person 2, U.S. person 3. We tried to shield the anonymity of that particular person in a handful of reports, because what they're talking about normally is somebody in the government. U.S. persons for us is also defined very broadly. A United States company is a U.S. person for our legal purposes. Any individual legally in the United States is a U.S. person for our purposes under the statute. There's a whole series of protections and definitions. So, for example, when we get information via 702 about foreign entities' attempts to penetrate U.S. infrastructure, we'll shield the company name when we first report it. We'll mask it. But, for example, I sometimes, as the director of NSA, because we have a mission to defend computer network defense, to defend our systems, I will then put in a request to say, look, I need to unmask. This is clearly a company, and I need to figure out, is this U.S. company, has it been penetrated? I can't reach out to them and give them insight and warning if I don't know who they are. So we have a formal process where in writing, you have to make a request and show justification for why you should be given the identity of that U.S. entity.
So, this is obviously it's a United States debate, but it's just worth adding that we and many other allies are massive beneficiaries of what NSA can achieve through 702, and there are a lot of our citizens alive, particularly on counterterrorism today, who wouldn't be if that capability wasn't there. So we have a strong interest in this.
Let me ask you about something that NSA did to protect privacy because of privacy concerns under this 702 regime several months ago, and that was to more or less voluntarily stop collecting the so-called upstream collection where in your 702 request there were additional U.S. Names, targets, email addresses, whatever, that then flowed into your computers that were accessible for larger purposes, and you decided, no, it's just too dicey. We're not going to continue to keep that. That gets purged out. So my question is, has there been an intelligence cost to you that you can discern since you stopped doing that?
Yes, but I knew that when we made the decision. Why? Well, one of the things I told the team was, it is foundational that everything we do fully complies with the law. One of the things we do regularly is we do independent reviews and assessments of our execution of what we do under 702 authority. One of those reviews highlighted to us one of the technical solutions we had put in place, it wasn't working. We then spent 6 months working with the FISA court to see if we could come up with a solution that I felt confident I could go to the court and the Department of Justice and say, you should feel comfortable that the technical solution we put in place is going to ensure we're not accessing inappropriately data. After 6 months, I didn't like the technical solution. I wasn't confident. And so I recommended to the DNI and to the administration, we need to walk back from this. I acknowledge there will be a cost in intelligence production. But the most important thing to me is that we engender the confidence of the citizens we defend. And I want them to know that we are an organization that is self-critical, that when it sees something that's wrong and is not working as we thought, we will stop doing it and we will figure out what do we got to do to fix it. And until we figure out what to do to fix it, we're not going to do it anymore. And so we went to the court and we told the court we were going to stop what we call upstream It'll bore you with the technical details. There's two broad categories, downstream and upstream. And so I said, we're going to stop doing part of this. We continue to do some aspect of it, particularly associated with computer network defense. Upstream generates amazing insights for us in computer network of defense. But upstream, in terms of the terrorism issue and a couple other things, I said, this is just the right thing to do. Meanwhile, I've told the team, let's keep working on a technical solution. And I told the court, if I can get the right technical solution, I intend to come back to the court and make a case. You should authorize us to re-implement this because it's legal under the statute. The statute says we can do it.
And Mr. Chandigan, I should just ask, you have obviously a entirely different regime legally, but is GCHQ still in a position to do quote upstream collection?
We can do upstream collection under our own regime, but as Mike said earlier, the fundamental core of the Five Eyes, and this was tested extensively in the courts and through endless committees after Snowden, where people were trying to imply that we got around each other's frameworks. We have to respect not only our own laws, but the laws of our allies, and it is legally as well as politically impossible to get around those.
So there's no way GCHQ could be sending back the information that Admiral Rogers now can't collect. Okay. So let me turn to Russia, and I really have to ask the ritual
Who thought that was going to come up? Who thought that was going to come up?
Well, I know it's a big surprise, but we've had here an Aspen Security Forum obligatory question. I think every guest gets asked it, and so I'm going to ask Admiral Rogers, and that is simply, do you have any doubt, based on the intelligence that you have reviewed, that Russia meddled through an organized covert influence campaign in our presidential election last year?
No doubt at all, and I stand behind the intelligence community assessment that we produced in January. I was part of that process, both as an organization, NSA, personally as the director. I knew that this was going to be an issue that was of strong importance to our nation. I personally got involved with it, and I stand behind that report.
So in the January 6th report that had the detailed summary of your conclusions, there was a slightly lower level of confidence
level,
among the different intelligence agencies. And it was widely thought that the lower level of confidence on a bit of this was NSA's. And I just wonder whether your level of confidence in that part of the package has increased since then because of additional collection.
So I stand behind the judgment. I thought it also shows you the power of the intelligence structure we have. 3 different agencies, NSA, CI, FBI, as well as the 4th, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We each worked on that report collaboratively. As we were going through it, because I said, look, I'm going to stand behind this. I know I'm the one that's going to be testifying. This is one that I'm going to be held accountable for. So, guys, I sat down and talked to the analytic team, but I said, in the end, I'm going to make this call, and then I'm going to stand behind the call. And one aspect of it, I said I was in a slightly lower confidence level than my FBI and CI teammates. I thought the power of the whole thing, we were very public about that. Read the unclassified version of the report, and you will see in there, we specifically state that. To me, that goes to the power and the integrity of the IC. When we have a difference of opinion, we will put that in writing, and then we will stand by that. I thought that was a great testament, and that's, as an intelligence professional, I'm telling my team, that's exactly the way this has got to work, you guys.
So I have another question which I just feel is essential for me to ask you in this space.
That's always the ones where
watch out. So this is a week in which we had another clear set of evidence in President Trump's interview with the New York Times of how much he values personal loyalty. We think of our intelligence agencies as being about independence from politics, not about political loyalty. So I want to ask you, as NSA director, and this echoes, in a sense, a question that you were asked before the Senate Intelligence Committee in your testimony on June 7, and at that time kind of declined to answer. But I want to ask again, you were asked then, had there been any pressure from the President on you to say that there had been no collusion? He said, I just don't. So maybe pitching it forward and saying, if there was a request to you as head of one of our key intelligence agencies to support the President in a way that was political, was about political preservation of this White House prerogatives. Give us your sense of how you would respond to that, and if you can assure us that you would maintain that tradition of independence, I think we'd love to hear that.
So if I could, let's be very specific. I declined to talk in an unclassified forum about a classified conversation I had with the President of the United States. I also said it at that same unclassified forum, in the 3+ years that I have been the director of the National Security Agency, the largest intelligence organization in the U.S. government, I have never been directed to do anything that I felt was illegal, immoral, unethical, or inappropriate. Nor have I felt pressured to do so. Nor would I do so. I will tell you exactly what I tell the workforce. Guys, we are intelligence professionals. We raise our right hand and we take an oath to defend the citizens of this nation and the values that are embodied in the Constitution. That's what we are about. We're not about particular viewpoints. We're not about particular parties. We just can't work that way. What we owe the leadership of this nation, and by extensions, the citizens that we defend, is honesty and integrity. And as a leader, I have no complaints when the President has been in my discussions with him. I am very direct. I will say things to him that I know he disagrees with. He will tell me he disagrees with them. He has never shut me down. He gives me good direct feedback. Mike, sometimes, Mike, I don't agree with that. Mike, I'm in a different place than you are. That's exactly the way this is supposed to work. That's exactly the way this is supposed to work.
So I'm just going to take this one step further, but I think it's so much on our minds. So if and I'm just going off this morning's tweets.
Which I haven't seen, so I couldn't tell you a thing about it.
If the President were to say to you, this Russia investigation is a distraction. It's preventing me from conducting my presidency. There's no foundation to it. And I am going to fire the special counsel, direct those to whom he reports to fire him. And I think it's time that our intelligence agencies, our FBI, cease cooperating in this investigation, which I have judged is inappropriate, unnecessary, and I'm firing. How would you, as head of NSA, respond?
I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. I will not violate the oath I have taken in my 36 years as commissioned officer. I won't do that. And I constantly tell the workforce, your integrity isn't worth the price of me or anybody else. You stand up and you remember that oath that we take. There's a reason why every promotion, for example, ceremony that we do at NSA, every promotion I've ever received as a military officer, we repeat the oath of office. We remind ourselves, why are we here? What are we about? What is it that we are defending? Why do we do this work that we do? We have always got to remember that, and I won't sacrifice that for anybody or anything.
So, thank you. I want to ask Mr. Hannigan about GCHQ and collection on Russian meddling. And I want to quote something that appeared in the New York Times, one of America's leading newspapers. The Times wrote, quote, GCHQ was the first agency to warn the U.S. government that Russia was hacking Democratic Party emails during the presidential campaign. So my first question is, how did you know that?
Well, we have never commented on either confirmed or denied that report, although I've seen it before. No, Not least because, unlike Vladimir Putin, we don't want to get involved in US politics. But we don't comment on these things anyway. All I would say is it would be entirely normal for our two organizations every day, many times a day, to be passing each other tips of intrusions we've seen into each other's networks. And we would hand it over and say, off you go, and maybe of interest to you. That's the heart of the Five Eyes. That's what we do. That's what our staff do many times a day. So the principle is not a controversial one at all.
And it works the opposite way as well. I mean, we are so... If you come out to Fort Meade, and not just Fort Meade, but if you go to our sites, you will see GCHQ teammates working side by side with us. If you go to GCHQ facilities in the United Kingdom, you will find NSA employees working there. We are partners in every sense of the word.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience after one more question. It's just one I want to make sure that we raise because it's on the horizon and it's really important. And that's the question of splitting Cyber Command and the NSA. And I want to ask this in a contrarian way because there's a lot of, well, that's a great idea, and gee, let's do it, and why did we do it yesterday? So I want to ask you, are you sure that's a good idea? And underlying that skepticism is I watched our limited pool of counterterrorism analysts and professionals who used to work at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center then have to staff a second National Counterterrorism Center that was stood up. And from my advantage as a journalist, there weren't enough great analysts to go around in the beginning. And I wonder whether, as you stand up the separate command with limited resources of the smartest and best at the NSA, whether you're going to have enough people. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, Admiral Rogers, is in the moments where the new Title 10 authority, this independent cyber command, comes up against the prerogatives, aims of the Title 50 collection authority, the NSA, how's that going to get deconflicted? Who's going to decide whose equities predominate and whether you take down the cyber site or keep watching it to collect?
So let me do the second part first. The way we do it right now between NSA and Cyber Command, we have one individual who's accountable. His name happens to be Mike Rogers right now. And if I make a good choice, great. And if I make a bad choice, my bosses will tell you, Mike, you made a bad choice here. In the almost 3.5 years I've been doing this, I have been very comfortable in our ability to make tough trades. And I have not given either organization a blank check that says, we're always going to do it the way you want to do it. I refuse to do that. We need to do it on a case-by-case basis. And then we have a broader process within the interagency when we look to deconflict beyond just NSA and Cyber Command. And then to go to your first question, really, I believe that ultimately it's the right thing to do, but we got some work to do first. So my comment has been, we're digging into, so how do we do it? How long, what's a good time period? How long is it going to take? I was very concerned about, guys, let's not do something just for the sake of doing something and just picking an arbitrary date. In the end, it's about assuring both organizations' ability to generate mission outcomes because that's what our nation and our allies are counting on. So don't do something that ends up, hurting either organization's ability to execute its mission because that's a bad place for us to be. So I think it's the right thing to do, but we got some work to do first.
And Mr. Handy, before we turn to the audience, just maybe a paragraph so this audience has a sense of the new organization you have just stood up, the National Cyber Security Center, what it's doing and what its value of such an organization might be here.
So just to finish on the offensive cyber, I mean, our model is different. GCHQ has both sets of authorities in one organization, and we run the offensive cyber with the military from within the NSA equivalent. So but that brings its own problems, so there is no perfect model. On cybersecurity, well, shorthand, we faced the same problems as many governments on a smaller scale, the United States. Too many bits of government trying to lead on cyber and not enough skills, incoherence of advice, complaints about confusion of who is leading on response to incidents. So seeing the rising tide of these incidents, we wanted to get ahead of that, reorganize ourselves, and the common denominator, I suppose, was when we had those meetings, the Prime Minister would, out of the 12 people sitting around the table, would always point at GCHQ and say, so what's happened and what are we going to do about it? And I think that led inevitably to a conclusion that we would not only rationalize the leadership of operational cyber defense in the UK in one place. But a more difficult decision, we will put it under GCHQ. And we've called it the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's an operational arm of GCHQ. It is an experiment, a cultural challenge for us because it's semi-secret. It's got its highly classified end based in Cheltenham, part of it in London, and then it's got a industry, public-facing, low classification, open source side, which we think is the future for cyber because clearly you can't do it within the wire anymore exclusively. You've got to do it. Most of the data is out there. Two things drove it very briefly. One is people and the other is data. The only bit of government, certainly in the UK, that can attract world-class cryptologic skill, talent and computer science talent is GCHQ, really, and parts of the military because of the mission, because nobody else can afford to get those skills. So it's the mission that pulls these people in to do great things for their country. And we decided that we've got the skills there, let's use them. And on the data, everybody is now accepting that government has a fantastic slice of data and can do things in cyber that the industry can't, particularly reaching upstream to highly sophisticated foreign state actors. But most of the data, of course, is out there. It's open source. It's out in the private sector. So the ideal is to fuse both of those, and that works best if you site it within a secret agency where we have those alliances already in place and we are trusted. And we can then fuse that with open source data and reach out to industry and have a single source of advice. It's an experiment. We're a couple of years in. So far, so good. But it's just beginning to be tested with some major incidents. Like
if I could, I think it highlights the differences in the history in our cultures. In the United Kingdom, a much higher comfort level with the idea of security services, intelligence organizations, extensions of the government playing a very direct role in a core mission like computer network defense and the private sector. Our history, our construct as a nation, not quite in the same place in terms of comfort historically with the idea that you would have an intelligence organization or a security organization do that.
So let me turn to the audience. Please identify yourselves. Keep the questions brief, if you would, so we can get a number in. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Guy Swan from the Association of the U.S. Army and a member of the Aspen Institute Homeland Security Group. On your last point, Admiral, one player we didn't talk about this morning is the Department of Homeland Security. And as Secretary Kelly spoke earlier in the week, cybersecurity as an organizational function is starting to coalesce in the department. A lot of legislation being anticipated, organizational structures. How do you see that working with your mission?
So DHS is the overall lead in the United States government for the application of the government's cyber capabilities to support the private sector. Both as Cybercom and as NSA, boy, we spend a lot of time with DHS. In fact, we just were going through a couple of things where we were looking at applying DoD capability in response to some ongoing activity of concern where DHS had approached DoD and said, hey, we'd like to get access to some of your cyber capability. As on the NSA side, we constantly are providing defensive insights, knowledge in terms of what actors are doing, the specifics of malware, for example. We'll share that all directly with DHS. I have DHS people at Fort Meade. We have NSA people down with DHS and the NCIC.
So I recognize a number of people. The woman in blue, forgive me, I just can't see people from distance, and then the gentleman here with his hand up. Let's take those two questions, then we'll come back and get two more, and
Hi,
as long as we can.
You were mentioning limited resources among all of the departments. And I apologize if this is an unsophisticated question, not being in the sector, but with the many confused messages and communication tools of tweets and that sort of stuff, I'm wondering if a lot more resources in limited resource pools are being used to, among NSA, CIA, et cetera, to check, double check, and really dive into confirming, denying. I've been sitting here for 3 days and we've had the same questions asked, over and over and over about Russia, about communication, about different meetings. And I'm wondering how much of your resources, and is that a distraction for a lot of what would, might be where you're paying attention?
Well, I mean, for us, those are core missions for us. So it's not a distraction. It's part of our mission set to generate insights as to what is going on out there. We also support, from a counterintelligence standpoint, FBI and CIA and their that's not a primary mission for NSA, but NSA, because of the power of SIGINT, we're the largest producer within the intelligence community. We generate more than anybody else. We generate insights that we know feed those broader processes. So I apologize if I'm not responding well to the question, because to be honest, I don't exactly understand, but I wouldn't categorize what I thought I heard as a distraction anyway. For me, it's part of our core mission.
Maybe are you stepping up your efforts in this area in response to the level?
Am I increasing a greater level of investment in terms of gaining insights and information assurance and computer network defense, in knowledge of what foreign actors are doing? Oh, yes.
Specifically Russia?
Yes.
Okay. Sir.
Thank you very much. Elmar Tivison with German Television. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Wie geht es Ihnen?
Sehr gut, dankeschön.
Yeah.
I hope to
it
see
really
you
is
in
the
Germany.
post-Snowden era.
That's the post-Snowden era, right. I want to follow up on something that you said, Mr. Hannigan, a few minutes ago, that the Five Eyes partners have respect for the laws of the partner and have to respect the laws as well. And I just want to make sure that I understand you correctly, because, of course, there has been this famous meeting in March 2002 in Wellington, New Zealand, of the Five Eyes, where George Tenet said that the handcuffs have been taken off after 9/11, and he made a suggestion that there should be an agreement if a country cannot do something because the laws of itself prohibit it from doing so. For example, the Americans from spying on U.S. citizens. Why not have one other partner of the Five Eyes do that for them, and then the finished intelligence will be turned over to the country? That is well sourced that this happened back then. I don't know if it happened, but I don't know if they followed up on that suggestion. But I was wondering, can you categorically say that this did not happen after 9/11, that it is not happening, and it will not happen in the future?
Well, I wasn't there in 2002, and I can only speak to my time and indeed my predecessors, as I was around then as well. I can categorically say that it would be unlawful for us to do that. So we'd be breaking our own law. So it is not possible for us to use another country knowingly to circumvent our own laws.
I did see a former NSA director waving his hands dramatically saying, no, couldn't be done. Can I get two more questions?
Mike might have been there.
Chris Eischen and from Kim Dozier, and let's get pass the mic from Chris to Kim, and then we'll come back to our panel for final answers. Chris?
Thank you, Chris Eischen with CBS. Question about the targets, the capability of the targets, and terrorist organizations, specifically like ISIS. What evolution have you seen in their communications, their use of various cyber methods themselves, and what kind of challenges has that presented for your organizations?
So I would argue they have the greatest rate of change of any target I've ever worked in 31 years. You see them constantly changing their applications. For example, just a couple of days ago, I'm sitting down with the team at Fort Meade, and I'm going, okay, let's review what we're doing in Mosul and Raqqa right now to generate insights. And as we're walking through this, I honestly said to the team, now, do you realize that what we're doing right now is nothing like what we did 10 years ago? Take Mosul as an example. In the same battle space, we're going against totally different target sets, totally different comms profiles. This opponent has totally changed from when, for example, they were AQI in a previous iteration. I think that's the nature of the world we're in now, and we're going to be going into in the future. And I expect it to jump from the non-state actor into the nation state, because I'm watching nation states now use some of those exact same commercial capabilities that are available.
And they're great at learning. They have learned how to move fast to avoid us.
Because remember, the price of failure for them is they will be killed or captured. That's a great impetus to stay on top of your game.
Kim Dozier, last question.
Two questions for Admiral Rogers.
In 4 parts.
Are you engaging in talks with Russia on a cybersecurity cell? And if not, or if not yet, is it a good or viable idea? And for Director Hannigan, what did you observe in Russia's election hacking that you're watching in Britain, in Europe, in the United States? how has their behavior changed in recent years as opposed to previously? Are they being more public about it?
Good.
So
Evan Rogers?
let's see. For me, it was a two-part question. First part was the cell idea.
Yes.
So I'm not a policy guy. You got to talk to somebody else. That's not what we do. In terms of, hey, what's my thought? I would argue now is probably not the best time to be doing this. That, on the other hand, perhaps this is something that you could hold out that we might want to build to over time were we to see changes in behavior.
All I'd say, Kim, is yes, we've seen it obviously all over Europe, and we are collectively helping our European allies, particularly the Germans who have the election upcoming. The biggest change for me, I think, is just the brazen recklessness of it. I think the fact that they don't seem to care that it's attributed to them very publicly is the biggest change. We've always seen them on our networks. We've seen them doing attacks. Back in the 90s, we were studying Russian malware. So it's not new in that sense, but there has been a change in their political intent and handling of that.
So I can remember a time when a public, on-the-record conversation like this with two SIGINT chiefs would have been unimaginable. This has been wide open. I want to ask everybody to join me in thanking Admiral Rogers.